The American dream has become a nightmare. Signs of the time are on cardboard on corners in town. Like a cancer that's silently spreading, there's an unspoken fear. We're on our way down. We must take America back, Main Street to Wall Street.
Hi folks, I am Alan Watts and this is Cutting Through the Matrix, standing in for John Stadtmiller on the 25th of January 2010. I'll be on for the next couple of hours, and there are so many topics to cover because, as you know, we're going through the greatest changes in history for hundreds of years actually. It's actually been akin or linked, at least by the big boys themselves, like the Brzezinskis and Kissingers, to the greatest changes since really the beginning of the Industrial Revolution and the massive changes it caused across countries as they moved people into the big cities to take over the industry and produce in the factories, get them off the lands. Today, it's much, much bigger. It's literally a global enterprise. We're in a big global system planned an awful long time ago. And all the mayhem we see with money crashes going up and down, all this kind of stuff, the deculturalizing of nations, denationalization of nations, was all factored into it and planned that way an awful long time ago. It's just that the ordinary people don't read the reports put out by the big think tanks, by the global meetings that the United Nations has, and that's because really the media keeps us distracted. Their job is not to focus us into what's happening in our time. Their job really is simply to give you the results of the happenings as they happen, the effects, if you like, without telling the public the causes. They don't want the public to be involved. In fact, they actually call it a post-democratic system. In a post-democratic system, think tanks, elites, academia run the show. That's what we've had, in fact, for an awful long time. And it really took off back in the 1960s as academia stepped in. Big corporations, big foundations with their parallel government, as they call it themselves, of thousands of non-governmental organizations pretending that they're all specializing in different parts of society, took over and have had their annual meetings at the United Nations or one of the exotic countries they travel to. We simply get little bits out the paper which really have nothing much to do with the meetings themselves, to be honest with you. I can remember when the 2005 meeting of the president of the US, the Prime Minister of Canada and Mexico were shown on Canadian television down in Waco, Texas, signing the first open part. They had signed many parts which were not open to the public, but the first open part to the integration of the countries. That was integration in security, integration in economics eventually, taxation that was mentioned as well, and commerce. So much so that the newspapers the following day mentioned the fact that bureaucrats in Ottawa could apply for similar positions in Washington, D.C. and vice versa. I taped that show. I had all the comments made by the CFR journalists who attended, who talked about this is the first part of a 5-part signing. One part every year up to 2010 for total integration. I played that on the air to listeners that year because it hadn't been broadcast in the US. Incredible. In the US, they saw the 3 leaders having a barbecue and a walk along a field somewhere. I think down at Bush's Ranch or something. But they didn't show you the meeting at Waco. It didn't show you what was actually happening.
Get ready for Real Talk Radio. You're listening to the National Intel Report with your host, John Stadtmiller.
Hi folks, I am Alan Watts and this is Cutting Through the Matrix, standing in for John Stadtmiller, who's off today. And I was talking before the break about how the whole century we've been living through was planned. It was planned just like today's society and where it's to go is planned. What's happening today, in fact, was planned before I was born, to be honest with you. When you read the writings from the Council on Foreign Relations, the Trilateral Commission, all the big meetings that the United Nations has had since 1946 or so, and you find that they plan to bring in this integrated society through conflict, in a sense. Through conflict. Everything, according to them, is a science of conflicts. And by understanding conflict, you can guide the conflicts. You can guide the outcome of conflict, or the synthesis, or the combination of the two conflicting parties. The synthesis, you can guide it. And sometimes that the synthesis is actually what you're after. We want to take the public or the world here. How do we do it? Well, you need two opposing sides. You get them to go head to head. Then you get negotiations. Then you get a form of amalgamation, which is the synthesis. And you've changed society. You've guided society. The theory being, in the Darwinistic sense, that these characters go by, and they really do believe in Darwin, the theory of evolution, not just man himself, but the societies or ages of man, as they call it. And they claim that if a stagnation period comes in because there's no conflict, then they start to lose control and things break out of their control and everyone goes their own way, which doesn't sound too bad an idea at times for me when I look at what's been planned for us. And therefore, they guide conflicts, they create conflicts and guide them. Now remember what Carroll Quigley, Professor Carroll Quigley, talks about in his book Tragedy and Hope, and his other book, The Anglo-American Establishment. These are two books which are utterly necessary if you want to understand how the system has been, how it is, where it's going, who runs it, the techniques that they use. And it also fills in all the blank spots in history between the dates of battles and all the rest of it. It tells you why they actually happened, who was behind it, who benefited from it. And he was rather proud of this and the techniques that they used. Being the historian for the Council on Foreign Relations, he thought the world should know. And he thought actually that most folk wouldn't mind being guided in a post-democratic system by a supra-elite crew of intelligentsia and very wealthy people. He thought that was a natural order, being a natural snob himself. He also thought that left in the people's hands you'd have utter chaos. That's a belief shared by all tyrannical type systems, that the masses themselves are simply incapable of managing themselves, and that there'd always be chaos. That only the ones who have better education, you might even say better breeding, if we were to use feudalistic terms, are the ones who can manage life and manage their laws and follow them, live in a sort of harmony. But for the peasantry, it could never be so. Don't ever believe that the Cold War was just about two systems going head to head. That was not the case at all. In fact, they needed a Cold War period between two enemies after World War II to bring in the changes that they needed, to also give them the reasons to tax the public, really put the money into research and development for a post-Cold War society where people would be monitored from birth to death, and give them all the technology, including the satellites up there, all the tracking mechanisms that are now being put into place, and we're seeing what they're up there for. They've been up there for years, as I say, put up during the Cold War for this particular time in history. 15 years before the Berlin Wall went down, it came out that Rockefeller led a team over to talk to the president of the Soviet Union 15 years prior to it, and told them, what are you doing here? Europe will be totally amalgamated, the European Union, totally integrated within the next 10 years or so. and you were left in the cold. You see, the Russians supposedly were after a European bloc themselves. They ran on blocks, remember, that's the term that they used, the Soviet bloc. Europe did the same thing that the Soviet Unions were doing. They amalgamated them all, and it's called the European bloc today, under the European Union. And therefore it would only leave the US, which didn't seem likely to amalgamate with the Soviet system, and other countries, even though America or the US, Canada, had already, in a sense, been Sovietized. We'd already been very liberal, as they call it. Khrushchev called it liberalism, the communist term that was used in the Americas. He says it's liberalism in America.